Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Thank you. As my previous colleague had said that I grilled you when you came to talk to me, and thank you very, very much for instilling some trust. In your discovery with witnesses' paperwork, did anyone within your findings within the DOJ system raise question about the truthfulness and possible misleading testimony that was being presented by the Attorney General in his testimony to Congress?
No one indicated that in their interviews with.
Did you directly ask the question?
I'd have to go back, frankly, and look at the transcript.
We would like you to ask that question. Okay. In detailing up with Lanny Brewer, it is my understanding that Lanny, or Mr. Brewer, sent and wide receiver, closed in 2007, if I'm not mistaken.
The investigative activity ended in 2000.
So we should know something about it. So Mr. Brewer sent members from the criminal division to review the auspices and directives of Operation Wide Receiver, true?
Correct.
Isn't this like having a prior? I'm a dentist, but this is like even worse than what Operation Wide Receiver would have been, because you know the outcomes here and you're still permitting it to go. And if I'm not mistaken, that's in March of 2010, right?
March and April. I believe it's April of 2010 that the meeting occurs where Mr. Brewer is informed that there's going to be a meeting, and his deputy goes to that meeting to discuss gun walking and wide receiver.
And that's with Mr. Voth, right?
That's with Mr. Hoover, the deputy director.
Oh, and then it gets better.
And the deputy assistant director, McMahon.
So then it gets even better, because if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Voth comes to Washington, D.C., and does a presentation on March of 2010, March 5th, I'm not mistaken. I think Joe Cooley was at that presentation, right, at the direction of Mr. Brewer?
On the March 5th presentation, that's correct.
So all these pieces are pointing to Brewer that he knows about this early on. And yet we have a problem. I have a problem with this with Mr. Brewer, because he's directly in the line of fire from what I'm seeing here, and we got problems, because not only does he go to send somebody back to Arizona, but he also has and listens to Mr. Voth's presentation and almost gets the thumbs up, no caution flags at all. And just like the wiretaps, these are alarming discoveries.
It is clear that Mr. Brewer was aware in April 2010 about the gun walking and wide receiver, which is why we were troubled by his decision to not tell the Deputy Attorney General or the Attorney General about it, because they have authority over ATF. He does not.
Okay.
And so that's why we found he should have done that.
It seems to me, but it's very alarming, because I think the scrutiny on Fast and Furious is much higher than what wide receiver is. They're both egregious, don't get me wrong. But this is, to me, you already know the results, and then you're making the results even worse.
Well, and that's why we were troubled when the information came to the Department from Senator Grassley in January of 2011 that those dots weren't connected by Mr. Brewer and by his deputy, Mr. Weinstein.
Okay. You know, the day after Brian Terry was killed, the Attorney General actually emailed 3 people asking for details, did he not?
That's correct. I believe it was the day after, but I recall the details.
This includes Gary Grindler, Monty Wilkinson, who failed to inform the Attorney General in connection of the Brian Terry murder with weapons from Fast and Furious, true?
That's correct. The failure to notify him about the connection between the 2 guns found at the scene, that they had been bought 11 months earlier by a subject that had been identified in Fast and Furious.
Now, going back to my colleague from South Carolina, you know, when a law officer is murdered, there's a lot of raised tensions and a lot of questions being asked. We have a whole scenario of things that occur here. I mean, the questions should have been asked, and we should have had a better outcome. But, you know, there was another incident in Arizona, late January, that should have had, I mean, my understanding with even Congressman Giffords is questions were abounding. Was one of these guns being used? Was that not?
I believe so.
So we should have known. I mean, you know, the Attorney General's testimony to me seems flawed, is that we would have been asking and should have known much earlier about these questions about Fast and Furious based upon the inquisition of the witnesses or witnesses to these crimes and the nature of these crimes and the audacity of these crimes, particularly to hire members like Congress, right?
Well, as I indicated in the report, we certainly believed that when that information about the guns connected to the death, to the shooting scene of a law enforcement agent, that that kind of information needs to go to the Attorney General of the United States.
And so it was covered up.
Well, I don't know whether it was covered up or not, but it was not told to him.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.